Yeah. Some people say Russia is inflexible. And are there any Russian conditions in the negotiations that are flexible? For example, about territory. What about the parts of Donbass that Russia has not taken yet? And what about Kherson and Zaporozhye and others?
Well, this is all reflected in many discussions. President Putin addressed this issue regularly when he is asked by journalists, or when he meets with President Trump, or with Prime Minister Orban, Prime Minister Fico, all those who are interested in talking to Russia, better understanding Russia's position. They always have a chance, an opportunity to come and discuss whatever is of interest for them. The new territories which you mentioned, they are not actually new territories. They are historic Russian territories. Yes, after the Soviet Union disappeared, this was left inside the former Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and there was no thought, that this Slavic republic could have leadership which would go the way the Nazis went before World War II. And step by step, Ukrainian government being independent from the Soviet Union, having proclaimed sovereignty and so on, they have been more and more under the pressure and influence of the Brits, Americans and Europeans, who were having a chance to implement the very old dream which Zbigniew Brzezinski expressed a couple of times, and some other American politicians, when they said Russia with Ukraine is an empire. Russia without Ukraine is a mid-level player, a regional player in international affairs. We never, thought about this in those terms. But the philosophy of the US politicians who were obsessed with not allowing Ukraine and Russia to be together is very telling. It's the same divide and rule logic, colonial desire to undermine alliances which would not be ruled by you. And we recognize the independence of Ukraine, no doubt about this, but we could never think that the people who live on these territories which you listed, which are now in our constitution, that these people would be considered second sort, especially after the coup 11 years ago in February 2014, when the putschist took power by illegal bloody coup, masterminded by the United States. Some time ago, after this event, Victoria Nuland admitted at the hearings in Congress that the United States spent by that time about $5 billion to support Ukraine, and she said it was not in vain, because eventually democracy prevailed. This democratic government, which came to power illegally, their first statement showing their political instincts was that they will cancel the status of the Russian language next morning after the coup. And the coup, of course, happened the day after Germany, France, and Poland guaranteed the deal between the then president, recognized by everybody as legitimate president, and the opposition. And when we called the French, the Germans, and said, guys, you guaranteed the deal, next morning the opposition took all government buildings and so on and so forth. And they said, you know, sometimes democracy takes an unexpected twist. Interesting. And then, of course, they sent armed groups to storm Crimean parliament. That's when the people of Crimea rejected this power, these authorities, and held referenda. Then Donetsk and Lugansk, the parts of Donetsk and Lugansk did the same. It is not for territories for us. It is about the people who have been living on those lands for centuries, more than 300 centuries. They were building cities, including the city of Odessa, a very famous place which was founded by Catherine the Great, whose monument recently was removed by Zelensky government, who would like to forget all parts of history which one way or another link Ukrainians and the Russians. But this is going to fail. He cannot undermine this. So my point is that, and when President Trump said about NATO in Alaska, when also in Alaska he mentioned about territories, for us it is not territories, it is the people who live on these territories. But when next day, when this crowd, European crowd, brought Zelensky to the White House, and after that Zelensky was talking to the media, and some Europeans were talking to the media, and they say nobody can prohibit Ukraine to join NATO, no territorial changes, no nothing. Actually, I will quote some of the statements by Zelensky and his team. They, from April 22, when Boris Johnson came and prohibited Zelensky to accept the deal negotiated in Istanbul, which was actually proposed by Ukrainian side and which was initial. But after this was undermined by Boris Johnson, now we know that he got about £1 million from his friend to continue the war, because his friend was selling arms to Ukraine. So after that, they said no negotiations with Putin, no negotiations, only he must be brought to International Criminal Court. We want European soldiers, we don't want no ceasefires, he was saying only 1 year ago. And then in September this year, he said to give to Putin one or another piece of land, this would never happen. It is not a solution, this is just a pause. And isolation of Russia is what must remain forever. So when people now say ceasefire, ceasefire, we know that they want just to buy some time again. And that this logic, which is deeply rooted in Zelensky, whatever moves him, head, brain, is obvious for any objective observer.
Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea, I understand, but what about Kherson and Zaporozhye? Could Russia ever talk about giving them back to Ukraine?
They are also part of our constitution, and the fact that this was not just imposed from above, like in Kosovo. The population was not asked. The representative of the United Nations, who was a former Finnish president, he just said Kosovo is independent, full stop. Unlike this trick, we based the decision to include them, to admit them back to Russia, because all these lands were founded by the Russian Empire and developed by the Soviet Union. Only after all of them, each of these 4 places after Crimea, held referenda and bluntly expressed their desire to rejoin with Russia. And when we now liberate remaining parts of Zaporozhye, this is the Russian way to pronounce it, and Kherson, the people, in spite of the attempts of Ukrainian army to pull them into mainland Ukraine, they are not, most of them are not leaving. They are staying and they are welcoming the Russian soldiers who liberate them. So this is not our will, our imperialist desire, some people say. This is our concern for the future of the people who feel being part of the Russian culture. By the way, when Zelensky and his entourage, like Macron, Starmer, Merz and others, they still say Russia must get out of Ukraine, out of 1991 borders. Yesterday, I think, they gathered in London for this coalition of the willing, and Starmer, addressing the media before the event, he said that Russia, Putin is the only one who doesn't want peace. And this deserves some explanation. Putin supported the deal between the government and opposition in 2014, immediately after the coup. Obama called him, Obama asked him not to block the deal. He said, if the legitimate president is signing something with the opposition, how can I block him? And then, you know what happened? The coup and explanation by the Europeans that sometimes democracy is very tricky. They did not lift a finger to stop this putschist, though they knew very well that they came to power under the neo-Nazist banners. Then in 2015, the Minsk agreements, we negotiated the Minsk agreements. We were prepared to implement them. They, as I mentioned, said that we never intended to do this, we just needed to buy some time. In April 2022, a couple of weeks after the special operation started, Ukrainians asked for negotiations. We agreed, we held several rounds in Belarus, and then moved to Istanbul. And in Istanbul, as I said, Ukrainian delegation put a paper with the principles to be developed into a treaty. We accepted this paper, it was initialed, and then Boris Johnson said, don't do this, continue to fight Russia until we defeat them. So when Starmer said that Putin is the only one who is against negotiations, he should remember about his former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. He should remember about those in Germany and in France who signed the deal and then a few years later admitted that they never intended to do this, in spite of the fact that it had been endorsed by the Security Council. And then Starmer continued to say that Putin must stop atrocities, must stop killing children, and he must withdraw to the borders of 1991. On children, it's a shame. I mean, the amount of lies, the amount of propaganda is astonishing. We have been hearing that tens of thousands of children has been stolen by Russia from their parents, and after the Istanbul process started this year, there were 3 rounds. At the very first meeting, our delegation asked Ukrainians, guys, you are concerned about the kids. Can we get the list of those kids who are missing? It took some time. Eventually, we received the list of 339 names. 339. No 10,000, not even 1,000. And we checked that list. a huge part of it are not kids, are grown-ups. Many have been verified as being in Europe. So when you listen this, but Starmer keeps saying that we must stop hijacking children. And as for 1991 borders, and Russia must withdraw, okay, hypothetically, in their dreams and delusions, if we leave the territories inside the 1991 Ukrainian borders, what happens to those people whom they publicly called, the respective governments of Ukraine after the coup called them inhumans, called them specious? Specious, by the way, is the term used by Zelensky long before the special operation started. He was asked in August 21 what he thought about the people in Donbass on the other side of the line of contact according to the Minsk agreements. And what he was asked what he thought about those people. He said, you know, there are people and there are species. And if you live in Ukraine and feel like being part of Russian culture, my advice to you, for the sake and safety of your kids, for the sake and safety of your grandchildren, get out to Russia. So, in fact, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, the population of these 4 territories, they follow his advice. They go back to Russia.
And what about Odessa? Because President Putin told the Hungarian journalist Gábor Stier in the Valdai discussion that Odessa is an ancient Russian city. What did you mean by that?
I just mentioned, it's just the fact which any educated person knows very well, that Odessa is a city. There was a very small village on that spot. And Catherine the Great founded Odessa. She built Odessa. She built the ports, she built roads, factories, and that's what is meant. And Odessa was always an international city, famous for its good humor. And Odessa, of course, is the heritage, and it is part of the UNESCO list of world cultural heritage. But when the monument to the founder of the city, Catherine the Great, was removed by the Nazist regime, UNESCO just stayed shut up. And the French Director General, Madame Azoulay, did not comment upon it at all.